Hello and welcome to Canada's History's Fall Webinar Series. This series revolves around women's history, as we know. Presenters will speak about prominent figures, moments, and places in Canada's women's history, as well as what has influenced the teaching of women's history in the classroom and what that looks like today. My name is Jessica Knapp, and I will be your host for this series. Tonight, Rachel Collishaw will discuss her experiences with and approaches to teaching women's history in the classroom. This is the second of 7 webinars in the series. Canada's History is proud to bring you this webinar series, as well as our many award opportunities and publications. Canada's History is dedicated to promoting greater popular interest in Canadian history, principally through publishing, education, and recognition programs. Our flagship publications are Canada's History Magazine and Kayak, Canada's History Magazine for Kids. If you would like to know more about subscribing to these publications, please visit canadashistory.ca. You can also click on the links you see on the screen, and it will open up the web pages for you. Each year, Canada's History recognizes excellence and honors the achievements of history makers and enthusiasts of all ages, predominantly through the Governor-General's History Awards and the Government of Canada History Award. If you would like to know more about these awards, please follow the web addresses on the screen. You can see they're hyperlinked there as well. I should mention that is for those who are joining us live. Unfortunately, those who are watching the recording, the links will not work for you and will probably only pause the video. In all cases, you're always welcome to email me for more information. Canada's History's vision is a Canada where people are deeply engaged in connecting with their shared past. To ensure the best experience possible tonight, I encourage you to close down any unnecessary programs your computer is currently running, for example, Photoshop or larger programs like that. That will help everything go smoothly. That being said, what's a webinar without some technical difficulties? So let's all knock on wood and hope there are none tonight. But if there are issues tonight, I will be recording, and the magic of editing will help the recording on YouTube, and in the next couple of days it seemed like there were no issues whatsoever. If you are on social media, you're welcome to spread the word about our conversation tonight, and as the recording becomes available, you're definitely encouraged to share the webinar if you think it's useful for your understanding of teaching women's history in the classroom. I have included Canada's History's Facebook link and Twitter handle on the page, so that will bring you right to the pages so you can follow and like us there. If you have any questions during the webinar, you are welcome to ask them at any time, and Rachel will respond as she sees fit throughout the night. So a little bit about Rachel. Rachel Collishaw has been teaching for 17 years in Ottawa and in New Zealand. She is a graduate of Queen's University and a recipient of the Governor-General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching. She is recognized as a leader in implementing historical thinking in the Ontario curriculum and regularly presents workshops for teachers and administrators on historical thinking and other ways of integrating inquiry into the classroom. She is a co-author of several textbooks and educational resources, and she is excited to share her thinking and experiences on teaching women's history to the average teenager. At this time, I am happy to turn over the presentation to Rachel as I upload her PowerPoint for tonight.
Hello everybody. I'm hoping all the audio is working, so just let me know if anything gets glitchy. I'd like to welcome everybody here and thank you very much for sharing your questions and perspectives, and I'm not sure how many of them I can get to, but please, if anything that I'm about to talk about or that I am talking about connects with a question that you have, please, please, please add the question in. I really want this to be as much of a discussion as we can have. So as Jessica said, I'm approaching women's history through the lens of inquiry and through looking at historical thinking. And there's a few reasons why I'm doing this. So I'm going to get to the first slide so I can remember what it was that I said I was doing. So guiding questions. So do students see women's history as relevant? So that was one of the guiding questions that I was thinking about as I was putting this together. So, I often, I am in Ontario and I teach typically a grade 10 required history class, which is 20th century history. So that's where my experience is. So I'll be pulling my examples from there. But I'm really interested. So Michael, you said you're teaching grade 8 students, and Evelyn, you're looking at grade 12. And different provinces have really different curricula. So please, if you have any questions or see any connections, let me know. So one of them is, how do we move beyond tokenism, right? So if we, okay, we're going to do a role play on the women's history. Not, not that role plays aren't bad. Role plays are awesome. But if we're seeing it as separate from the regular curriculum, that can be problematic. And then how do we deal with a lack of resources? And maybe that's going to connect with the person who is a material interested in material history. Yes, Evelyn. So, that's a real issue. And then how do we engage all learners? And of course, the lack of resources, I think, was connecting maybe with somebody else's question about how do you share it with younger students. So I will be showing you some resources and talking about some of the ways that Jeannie, thank you. So Jeannie, talking about some of the ways that I've dealt with lack of resources, and I'm interested to hear how that's worked out for you as well. And then of course the last thing, like how do we engage all learners in women's history? Like how do we get them to see it as part of their own history, whether they're women or not? So, so is women's history relevant? So one of the things that I really that I did, and it was sort of by accident. So we started out as a team trying to figure out, how are we going to integrate a lot of historical thinking into our teaching, and how are we going to change our teaching, because we're starting over here where we have a very, sort of a general content focus, and then we want to move into thinking more about history and giving students tools to think productively about history and in the ways that historians think. So one of the things that we did was we started with a sort of a mini unit, a couple days, where we're looking at the issue of prohibition. And one of the reasons why this particular topic, it's in my curriculum, so that's why we did it, but I also really felt that it was important to pick something that was interesting to students. And my general students tend to be pretty interested in alcohol because they're 15, and they're interested in crime, so that's pretty cool. And so all the years before I was teaching Prohibition, we would kind of look at the, bootleggers, and we would look at the flappers, and we would look at the, the crime stuff, and we would look at, people's different viewpoints on alcohol. But it wasn't until I really started teaching it with this question, what were the causes of Prohibition, that I got from the way that students saw it and kind of hooked into it, and then they were able to peel back the layers. And so one of the things that we had was, here's the causes of Prohibition. We did some reading, and then I kind of summarized them for them, and they had to rank them as to whether they were more or less important. And there were a number of them that were, women were, getting abused. So we're shifting from this idea of like, we're going to talk about gangsters to let's talk about domestic abuse. and why that might provoke a group of people to, advocate for this law. And, whether or not the law was good or not, we can talk about later. But right now, what we're talking about is what were the conditions that women were living in at that time. And so they're really taking that analysis perspective and really picking it apart. And so one of the things that I found to be very successful was to take a very social justice approach to topics around women's history or other histories of unfairness. So somebody else had a question about residential schools. And so, other topics that we've really sort of started by talking about was, sort of the Oka crisis. This 20th century, it's in my curriculum, and other things like that. So one of the things that I found is often, or I did for a long time, was I would teach this whole, let's look at Nellie McClung because she was great, or Agnes MacPhail because she was great, and here's why, she was great. And we can do that through historical significance, but we can also do it through a social justice lens and not look at, here's Nellie McClung as a great person, but like as a cause of prohibition, and what was her role in terms of making this particular event happen. So there's lots of different lenses, but one of the things that I found was that students would, typically turn off with, here's a great person, a great woman, and then they're like, oh, we're not that into it, because they don't connect with that particular person, or they can't get past the sort of present day ideas. So that's one of the ways I've tried to make women's history relevant to students. And here it is, Nellie McClung. So this cartoon is from the I found it in Canadian Source Investigated, which is an excellent grade 10 history textbook for Ontario. And the story I wanted to tell with this is really about how to get them hooked into it. So this cartoon hooked one of my students into doing an entire project about the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. And I actually really, I really love talking about Royal Commissions in class. First of all, they lend themselves really well to role plays and getting into historical perspective taking and kind of getting into those particular mindsets. But, typically, people say Royal Commission and they roll their eyes and they're like, we don't want to hear about that. But, I think Royal Commissions are really interesting turning points, right? Because something becomes so exciting or so problematic that you have to call one, and then there's recommendations that happen, and then you can see whether or not they get recommended. So this student found this cartoon in the textbook, and she was really not engaged with the class like all year, and this was for sort of one of her final projects where she was like, okay, I want to do something with women and law. And I looked at her and I said, and you thought that wasn't connected to history like all this time? But, regardless, she ended up taking this. And there's a lot of layers in this particular cartoon. You have to understand the context that created it, and all kinds of other things. So one of the things that is really important to me is to use those to find those good questions, right? The questions that students care about and that connect to historical issues. And typically, in my experience, kids tend to care a lot about things being fair, and so that's often how I get the kids on board with those kind of things. So moving right along, so. We'll do a little participation here. So just what's wrong with these statements? So women worked in factories in World War I, and that got them the vote. Or pick one to comment on. When women were declared persons, that meant they could vote. So I don't know if you feel moved, if you could sort of respond a little bit in the chat, that would be fantastic. What do you think? What's wrong with these statements? Why have I put them there? Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, it's not the full story. Let's hear some more comments. Evelyn's writing something. Yes, Evelyn. I agree. They're very broad. There's no depth, there's no contributing factors. And if you talk to a bunch of like historians, they would probably say that they're actually kind of wrong. That women working in factories was not actually the thing that caused them to get the vote. And after we just talked about prohibition and talked about how that was maybe connected to the vote and connected to these movements of social gospel that women were contributing to. Yeah, so these are very, very common. I hear them all the time in my classes, even after we've already taught things, and then I'm like, well, how effective was I in getting these kids to learn these things? But I think one of the factors that's at play is that there's these, yes, absolutely, the media and the narratives that are out there in society, right? So you can see them in movies, you can read books, and so in the Canadian history classroom, we have those things that are pardon me, sorry, my dog. Cole, can you get the dog, please? So we have these things that are out there in our society, and students hook into them. Exactly, Evelyn, because they're easy and because they're simple. So they, so students have these, so we need to really disrupt them, and we need to make sure that when they get out, they're motivated to question the narratives and they don't just swallow them. And I think when a lot of students come into history class, they think, I'm swallowing a narrative, right? That's what I'm doing here. My teacher is going to tell me what happened and I'm going to, learn it. And then I'm going to repeat it, which is really not the point of a history classroom. It shouldn't be the point of a history classroom. Thank you. The point is to, actually question everything that's going on. And so I think often history teachers get waylaid by well-meaning organizations who maybe provide you with free stuff to use in your classroom and say, here you go, here's all these free resources all about how, I don't know, how wonderful Sir John A. Macdonald is, or but that's not really your job as a history teacher, and we're working hard to try and change that. So I just wanted to show you, this is one of the ways that I, one of the resources that I use to disrupt that particular narrative of, women went to work in the factories in World War I and then they got the vote. So we start with a really great question. So this is from Canadian Sources Investigated, and what they've got is these sections. This page is the first page of sort of a 4-page section. And we've got a really great question to start us off with. Did the war really change the role of women in the workforce? And then we've got these graphs, and you can see, I think you can see it, that we don't actually have statistics for during the war. Like, the census wasn't there, so it was, 1901, 11, 21, and 31. And if you look at it, you see that women's participation really just increased about 2% every decade. And there's all kinds of other anecdotal evidence, secondary sources, and then other information on the other pages. But this to me is really like, the strongest evidence that, really the war itself didn't actually change women's participation, between these years and statistically. And so I've had different groups of kids work through this particular I guess, document set, and that's one of the things that how I conduct my class a lot now is I give them a question, they pick a topic, I've got sets of these topics, and they go off and they investigate and they come back with their conclusions. So did the war really change the role of women in the workforce? I've had groups come back and say, yeah, it totally did. And I'm like, where's your evidence? And they had some evidence, but it wasn't really that great because they didn't really dig into it and that they were still listening to the narrative. But I had this one group, well, several groups who really, got into it and were looking at the stats. And, yeah, it didn't really change the workforce. They were like, wait a second, the question is, did it really change the role of women in the workforce? And then they came back and were like, yeah, it didn't really. So, posing those kind of complex questions, rather than just, what were the positive or negative outcomes or that kind of thing, like, it's really looking at how complex is change, really. And it's, typically when we look at women in World War I in traditional textbooks or resources, we often say, okay, women contributed in this way, this way, and this way, and we're not really questioning that narrative. So this resource is directed at academic students, but I wanted to kind of talk about a few other resources that I've used. And this is this is from the Begbie Contest Society, this particular image. And so that was a fantastic contest started by Charles Howe in BC, and he's a two-time Governor General History Award winner. And so his goal was really to get primary sources in the hands of teachers. If you click on that link, you can go and you can see there's like 20 years of questions. I mean, they're aimed at high school kids, but you can come up with some fantastic visual sources. And I think that's one of the things that we are lacking in a lot of the textbooks that are out there is, they're all using the same cartoon. They're all using the same image when, in history, of course, there's hundreds and hundreds of images around the same thing. So this one, requires a bit more investigative work on the teacher's part. It's not totally ready to go, but if you're looking for something, I need an editorial cartoon on whatever, his contest deals with Canadian history from 1850 to the present, I think. So it does go back a little bit further than a lot of the resources I'm going to talk about tonight. This is a great. So he's got this image, but he's also written this question, and it's not just him. There's a committee of people that were doing it. They're no longer running the contest, but all the stuff is up there. So there's this question. So is it duty, fashion, courage, and adventure? And you can take it just in this very kind of simple way and have students try and analyze. And I think it's a great model for how to do critical thinking using multiple choice questions if you want to do that. But what I asked students to do was kind of pick this apart and say, well, what does this tell you about women at that time? And compare it to a similar recruiting advertisement that you might see today for the Canadian Army recruiting women. And when they think about it in those contexts, which is kind of change and continuity, they would think about it and they go, oh yeah, they wouldn't be portraying women all dressed up to the nines with their hair fancy and their lipstick on and, looking at this, beautiful uniform in the window. They would be showing women, doing stuff like jumping out of helicopters and all those things that women do today in the Army. So you can really dig behind a lot of those conceptions just with a visual source, and you have to teach kids how to decode those things and how to think critically about them as well. So I think that was media was appealing to what women. Yes, absolutely. And I think, Evelyn, you could also take a look at how media is appealing to what women are attracted to now, right? So you kind of spin off into another kind of analysis there. And yes, absolutely, that's what women were attracted to, and that's why it was effective, and that's the historical perspective. That's the time that they were in, right? And that's how it was different from today. And I mean, this is just one example, but there's numerous examples from particularly Canadian history where they were trying to make the Army military factory work seem more ladylike than and so that would be appealing to women. So I see Evelyn's typing, and I will get to your question, but I thought I'd just carry on here. So, so this is a page from History Uncovered, which is a text that I co-authored last year. And one of the things that I really wanted to look at was, what were women's roles during the war? Like, how do you, because kids need to know that too, but how do you teach that in a questioning way? And this text is directed at applied level learners, so learners with low literacy, students of English as a second language, and I've actually had sort of grade 7, 8 teachers kind of take it just because it's easy for them to read. Like the text is small, everything is on the 2 pages. So one of the things that I wanted to do that was to take a look at what were women's traditional roles, like what was it like to be a woman at that time, and and what were the expectations, and how were those traditional roles valued and also important to the war effort. So because that's one of the strong narratives, is like, oh, women were just at home, they weren't doing anything important, and then we go to work and now we're important, right? So but of course, women were working all the time, and that those roles were important. So so we have this strong visual on the left, sort of, with women as the people that need to be taken care of, and I mean that was a reality, as well as the woman on the other side who's like fixing a car, and the quotations from the nurses who were talking about how they feel valued in their new work. Yes, Evelyn, I would agree. So Evelyn said, we have to be careful to make students realize what we feel and think today was different than in the 1940s. And that is exactly what we're trying to do with the idea of historical perspective taking. So it's that idea that people of the past thought differently, felt differently, believed different things than we do today. And I think that is one of the tricky things to deal with when you're dealing with social justice issues, like women's rights, because people did have different thoughts and different beliefs and different experiences. So, we can look back and say, oh, prohibition was a failed experiment. They were so dumb, right? But that's presentist thinking. And I give students words like that when we're working on through historical presentism or historical perspective taking, so that they can, this is a presentism, this is an anachronism, this is, different explicit terms, so that they can see when they are being historically accurate and when they are being a little bit presentist. So the only other thing on here that I didn't point out is this quotation on the left-hand side, and it's one of my favorites, from Nellie McClung, talking about, the mother's investment of blood in the war, right? That just by being a mother and by having your son go off to war, you are contributing something. And it's pretty tricky for a 15-year-old to kind of understand that, because clearly, hopefully, most of them are not mothers. But just to have them you're going to join up, why are you going to join up, blah, blah, blah. But that whole perspective of, hey, think about the impact on everybody else. So, so here's essential questions. So one of the things that I think is really important is that we are changing the way we're doing history in the classroom, and we're looking at constructing knowledge, constructing our own narratives, having students connect to the information in different ways. And one of the ways that I've found to be really effective over the last couple of years is to use these essential questions. So I actually, in one course, I use this question: is Canada a country you could be proud of? As our essential question for the course. So everything that we did at the end of every unit, we would sort of rank everything on this, scale. How proud am I of Canada's past, and how ashamed am I? So we're not taking a historical perspective. I mean, we're trying to keep in mind those historical perspectives, but we are actually making a judgment in the present and saying, this was a good thing that Canada did before, or this was, not so good. And students are debating that, and we put at the end of every unit, instead of having a unit test, we put their choices of events on the wall, and related to the question. So in the first unit, say we're looking at World War I in the 20s, and they would put things like, the person's case, or, residential schools started, or all Canadians got cars. Sorry. So those kinds of things would become part of the students' narratives, and they would make choices about what they thought was more significant in relation to the question. In other classes, I've used several questions. So I've also used questions like, is Canada a better place now than it was before, which is sort of a variation of the first one. And then the other question that I use is, how is Canada's story my story? Where are we at here? Yeah, so how is Canada's story my story? So we had some interesting discussions about that, and sort of connecting different events in different ways. So when you start with a big essential question, you have to spend some time, and I use them in units and for particular activities like the one I showed you before, where we have to generate criteria to be able to understand the question. So what do we mean, by proud? What would make you ashamed? Like, what would be a great country, right? So we have to define what is a great country, and what do we mean by that, so that we're all speaking the same language. So we're not just saying, I'm not just saying, well, this was great for women, and you should think it's great too, right? The students are creating those criteria for what is great. And they come up with some great stuff. And it's interesting because that's another great way to see historical perspective taking, right? So they might say, well, we think, we'd be proud of Canada, it'd be a great country if we were like very environmentally responsible. And then we look back at, the 1920s, we say, well, were Canadians thinking about that? Like, was that even part of their thinking, right? So that it becomes a little bit more aware that way. And so then they have to assess the events based on the criteria. So, and this is from the Big Six, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's a great introduction to historical thinking. And there's lots of great teaching activities as well as sort of academic background. So, where does this come from, and how do historians use these historical thinking concepts, and then how can you use them in the classroom? So the rank system we used was just +2, +1, 0, -1, -2, from like pride to shame, and events could be neutral or both at the same time. So we always had some interesting debates and discussions. And at one point, I had all of my students had these events spread across the wall from the first unit, and we had Vimy Ridge was at every single level of that, from +2 to -2, and students had reasons for all of that. So it was really, really interesting to look at those, to look at it from that perspective, because the students are creating their own, as we're going, their own ideas about what is important, what's significant to them. So then this is at the end of the course, they have to answer the question and then choose events and people to support their thesis. So they have to do that. So the reason why I'm telling you this is because I want you to listen to one of my students, and him. So he had the full 20th century to choose from, all of the things that we learned, and he decided, and I want you to listen to what he said when he was constructing his question or his answer. And it's about a minute of audio, and I think Jessica is going to play that for us right now. It's amazing, making the technology work.
I think Canada is a country to be proud of. But there is some stuff that we have done, so rank it around +1.
Okay.
One of the things that I think we should be proud of is how women won the right to vote. Yeah.
So how did women win the right to vote? Like, why should we be proud of that?
Because, well, wait, was that? Yeah. Okay, so they fought for it and they didn't give it up, and it also makes Canada a little bit more closer to equality. And I think equality is a good
Something to be proud of?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a lot of I like the story about it, kind of like how Nellie McClung, she got told that women were persons and that nice women don't want the vote, and then she came back and pretty much said it back to them, except for nice men don't want the vote. And I think that was interesting.
That is pretty clever.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks, Jessica, for making that very smooth. So I am interested in your reflections. So what did you hear in that little clip? What did you notice? And what do you wonder? Hey, Rose is here. Thank you, Rose, for that lengthy discussion. I'll get back to that. Thank you, Jessica. Yes, he did like the story of Nellie McClung, and I mean, clearly we watched the video about Nellie McClung. One of the things that you might want to remember is so, if that student was answering the question, if I'd asked a similar question, what makes you proud of Canada? And if it was like a timed exam kind of thing, he probably would have just said, yeah, women got the right to vote. I'm proud of that. And that whole idea that he was able to expand his thinking, and that he would, that he was able to share the entire story and show really that he understood it to some degree. Yes, thank you, Evelyn. He did have some trouble expressing what that means, and I think that's one of our critical jobs as teachers, is to help students express what they really mean and what they're thinking, and put that into ways that are can be understood by others. And I think when you're looking at that social justice perspective, it's really it's that way that you can hook students in. Anybody else have any other thoughts about the audio clip? So I'd just like to echo what Rose is saying here about that women did have widely different experiences, and one of the things that I'm trying to do in all of my writing of resources is to provide those different experiences, and that was sort of the point of that earlier slide, showing there were lots of different women having lots of different experiences, And the other thing that I think is really critical, and I'm sure Rose would agree with me, is the naming women. So just making sure that you know, it's not just some woman. It's it's a woman with a name, or perhaps just a context. But giving as much information as is important to make those people human, and particularly important when we're talking about First Nations issues as well, or other dispossessed groups of like dispossessed in history groups. Yeah. I agree, Evelyn. And that's the whole idea of presentism, right? That it's very difficult for them to kind of take themselves out of the present day. Yes, Jessica, I thank you for bringing up that point that he said, the vote brought Canada closer to equality. And it was really interesting discussing that particular issue with my students, because they had to rank things all the time. They had to say, are we proud of this? Are we ashamed of this? They had to do, different kinds of timelines. And at the end, they had to give that ranking, right? Like, is this a better place than it was before? Are we proud of it? Those kinds of things. And so they would have those conversations, and we say, well, yeah, we're not there yet, but look at this, like we've come this far. So that was a really great effect of asking students to construct their own narratives, and asking students to engage in those big questions, to say, yeah, let's ask these questions together. Let's collaborate. Let's figure it all out. Let's construct our own narrative, so that it's not just, yeah, we're equal now and it's all good, which is one of those other tropes of women's history as well. So I only have one more slide, which is just a list of resources. So these are some of the resources that I talked about this evening. So the Begbie Contest Society has fantastic primary source documents, and each year of the contest is there's an essay contest, an essay which is set up with a great question and has 10 primary source documents, written and visual, very short, very well selected from a variety of perspectives. So and that, I think, is speaking to Rose's earlier comment that people in history didn't all just think one way, whether they were women or men. There were different groups of people who had different points of view. And so that's a fantastic way to get into it. Another one which I did not list here is the Critical Thinking Consortium, or TC2, which has also excellent primary source document sets with secondary sources as well. Thank you, Rose. Her Stories Cafe, Suggestions for Classrooms. And so the Big Six was the other one that I talked about. So that's the sort of primer for teachers on what is historical thinking, and some ready-to-use activities that you can just implement in the classroom. The Historical Thinking Project, so that's been an ongoing work of Peter Seixas and a number of other great thinkers in historical thinking who have put together a website. There's some resources to download as well. The two books that I mentioned were Canadian Source Investigated, History Uncovered. I have a website as well, so that one, I have my resources posted there. So if you're curious about anything I was talking about, then you can go there and have a look around. And then I noticed somebody said at the beginning that they were reading 100 Canadian Heroines, and it's one of my favorite books about women's history. Thank you, Jessica, for posting the link to TC2. But yeah, 100 Canadian Heroines is a fantastic resource, and I often hand it to students, and they're like, I really want to do something about women's history, but I don't know what to do, and I don't know, I'm not that fussed about Nellie McClung. So I says, here you go, look at these 100 women, and it's just a couple pages on each, but really gives some great background. So it's been a great resource for me in the classroom. Yes, thank you, Rose. The Great Unsolved Mysteries. And then yep. And so Evelyn has a question here. Do you ever approach the issue of women's day-to-day lives and not just their role in politics? Yeah, absolutely. And I think the day-to-day lives are really critical to understanding what women were doing at the time. And so those things are, we reveal some of that, in that prohibition unit where we're looking at, what were women, what were women doing, and why were they advocating for, this banning of alcohol and all of those things. I'm just having some trouble thinking off the top of my head uh, what I might, another good example, um, but yeah, it's true. When we're looking at historical, uh, when using historical perspective taking, it's really important to look at those sort of daily lives. And I would use that more if I were looking at sort of also older history as well. So, and I think that's really important to explore um, in like pre-20th century history is what I mean. Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Evelyn, about how how happy are you with your role now? And I think it may be difficult for teens to see that today, because they haven't, things look all rosy. They haven't encountered a lot of some of them have for sure, the challenges. I think it's a great question to start with. Um, and certainly really important in my classes, which are quite diverse as well. Where students are coming, with an expectation. Yeah, I'm going to get married when I'm done high school, or maybe before I'm done high school, and how does that work, and how's that same or different, and how's that fit into 20th century, 21st century um, Canadian society as well. So, but I think the key there is to make sure, like, to connect with students and to have them question their world and see through the lens of history. Sharon, I think that's an excellent point. The white women's history, and that's one that I don't feel like I've got some good answers for how to do that, but I think just asking those questions is really, really important. And I really love that question at the end. Who was the first woman in their family to get the vote? And so that's fantastic. Thank you. Resistance in schools and including women. I think it really depends who you talk to. Um, my feeling is, we're moving towards equity all over the place in schools, and I think women are a big part of that, in terms of being more inclusive in terms of your resources and your schooling. I think it's more just at this point people just not knowing how. I don't think there's people saying, why should I include women? Or if there are, I don't think there's very many of them. I think it's more just, how do I do it, and what's token and what's genuine. Um, and yeah, I think for me the answer lies in, asking students the right questions and allowing them to generate the learning that is relevant and important to them, and pointing them to excellent sources that will help get them there. That is challenging, Evelyn. And I think I would call myself guilty of that, say, 10 years ago in my teaching, for sure. And I think for me, the biggest difference was to kind of be more exposed to what is it that historians are doing and thinking, and how do we think about these issues. And I think learning using those tools of the historical thinking concepts have been really important for me to really approach things in a more complex way, rather than looking at binary type questions. and I think teachers really haven't been trained in those things very well to date, and I think it's changing, but it's going to be slow. One, the other thought that I'm having about your comment, Evelyn, is the whole idea that, you know, what women were thinking today versus what they were thinking 100 years ago. And I mean, prohibition is such a great way to get into that, right? Because, like, clearly they were not thinking the same way as we were, because they thought prohibition was going to end domestic abuse and, you know, help advance women's cause in society, and that it was intimately connected with the vote, you know, the struggle to get the vote. You know, and that, I mean, it's just like a foreign thing. I mean, it's a bit of an oversimplification, but yeah, I mean, it's such a great example. Oh, Jeannie, that's great. I love it. Yeah, I think those provocations are so important. You know, at a secondary level, I tend to use, you know, very short videos or images or that kind of thing. But the clothesline, the wash tub, and the soap is fantastic. I've thought frequently about bringing in like a rotary dial phone and an answering machine and those kinds of things, and kind of having the kids to go around, do learning stations and say, what is this and what did people use it for? Sharon, it's a great question. Engaging in debate, and I think, you know, that's a whole nother webinar. You know, I tried to give you a little bit of a taste of some of the things that I do, but, you know, one of the things that I did was I took out the tests. We do, you know, assignments where students are creating historical products like exhibits or writing essays or that kind of thing. But instead of the test, we have this like whole class debate where they vote on what are the most significant issues or significant events or people, things from that unit, and then that goes up in the timeline, and that's when the debate happens, and it happens in small groups, and then it happens as a big group, and it's very organic. And I've had a lot of feedback from students saying, you know, that's one of my favorite parts of the class. Like, we just have these massive debates. And there was one about there was one about cell phones, and you know, the invention of the cell phone was going up on the timeline, and kids were like, no, that's not significant, it's not important, like, who cares? And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, how many of you have a cell phone? And it turned out that they didn't think it was important to, like, being proud of Canada, but they did think it was important as part of their own story in Canada. So then it became important when we changed the question, and I thought that was pretty interesting. Oh, you work at King's Landing. Oh, it's on my list of places to get to. It's fantastic.
And I think with that, we will start wrapping up for tonight. I just want to briefly mention about the use of technology and cell phones, and how the term hang up the phone is now slowly dwindling out of use. And I've note, I would like to do a plug for Peter Satius's Historical Thinking Summer Institute that Rachel mentioned. I did have the opportunity to attend this summer, and as not an educator myself, working for Canada's National History Society, I found it immensely helpful for understanding the big six historical thinking concepts, and I also was able to engage with many museum educators there. So for those who are working at museums and are considering it and thinking, oh, it's just for teachers, it's definitely not. Definitely consider it for the future summer professional development. So I would like to say now, thank you everyone for tuning into this webinar on teaching women's history in the classroom with Rachel Collishaw. And thank you, Rachel, for your presentation. It was fabulous and very engaging. I am sending out a link now. This will bring you to a survey that you can complete for tonight's webinar, just to let me know of anything we can improve, topics you'd like to see in the future, that kind of thing. And I would like to say I'll take Rachel, your barking dog, over technical difficulties any night. It was a pleasure. having you all here tonight. So in 2 weeks, we will hear about Canada's historic sites and the public history of women from the National Trust for Canada. I'm looking forward to that. And then we'll run into Canada's History Forum, which you are all invited to watch, whether live in Gatineau or via the live stream, which I will be hosting that afternoon as well. If you are interested in that, you are definitely welcome to send me an email and I can connect you with the proper forms to fill out. It's just a simple registration form. And I would like to mention Rose Feinmeier, who is with us tonight, will be presenting at that forum. So with that, thank you again, Rachel. And thank you everyone else for joining us. Have a great night.
Hey, great. Thank you, Jessica. And thanks everybody for the great discussion. Good night.